Welcome and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Fest Forward Advisor Talks, brought to you by the Ottawa Festival Network. In this podcast series, industry experts break down hot topics in the operational and strategic areas of focus that are essential for any festival and event organization. You will hear best practices and expert advice complemented by real-world examples and lessons learned from fellow festival producers that will help you solve problems, make decisions, and realize your creative visions. Today we're talking not one, but two very important areas for festival producers: security risk management and insurance considerations. And two topics mean that we have two excellent advisors speaking with us today. First, we will hear from Scott Hill. Scott is the founder and director of operations for 3D Security and Response Services. In addition to working decades in the security industry, Scott holds several professional designations in the security field, including Physical Security Professional and Certified Protection Officer. After hearing from Scott, we will hear from Chris Wilson. Chris is a commercial risk manager with over 15 years of hands-on experience in the industry. Chris provides advice on preventative best practices to mitigate hazards, insurance policy review to ensure coverage is appropriate, as well as helping to arrange customized insurance packages to ensure all risks of potential loss to your festival or event are considered. You can find out more information on both of these speakers and what they're up to in our episode show notes. Like our other episodes, the content presented in this podcast is not meant to be relied on as professional advice. It is for general educational purposes only, reflecting Chris and Scott's experience with insurance and security risk management. Viewers and listeners should seek out specific advice if they think it would be helpful, which can take into account their own circumstances. OFN and the advisors will not be responsible if you do not seek out your own specific advice. We acknowledge the support of the Canada Council for the Arts in the making of this podcast. And with all of that said, let's start this episode by hearing from Scott Hill.
Hello, everybody. My name is Scott Hill. I'm from 3D Security and Response Services. Very happy to be here talking about event security and risk management. 3D Security and Response Services is a fully licensed security company that also offers training such as first aid, tactical communication, and use of force training in Ottawa and Ontario. I always like to start the presentations off with a quote. And in this case, I'm going to use one from Max Mayfield saying that preparation through education is less costly than learning through tragedy. I always take that to mean that if we don't choose not to learn, then events will make us learn. So I congratulate everybody that takes the time to educate themselves better on these very important matters. The discussion points are going to be broken down into a couple of different categories. I'm going to be talking about the 7 Ps of security planning and some of the emerging threats, the pillars of emergency and risk management, how it gets applied to security, 9 steps for risk management, communication, and preparation and response. So if we look at the 4 pillars of emergency management, they are preparation, response, recovery, and mitigation. So the big thing that we're looking at right now is the preparation. And if we take the 7 Ps, which stands for prior proper planning prevents pretty poor performance, we'll see that the initial stage is the most important. Now, I believe the 7 Ps we've taken that from the military, and they might not say pretty poor. They might use some other words, but I've chosen to clean it up a little bit, and we'll say pretty poor performance. But the most essential part is the prior proper planning. That's the preparation. The response is obviously what takes place during the events, recovery, how we get back to normal, and then the mitigation of any risks after the fact. Some of the emerging threats that we're seeing in events is demonstrations and insurrections. We've seen that lately. Protests and riots. What used to be known as an active shooter is now being known as an active assault or a mass assault. A mass assault is when the goal is to inflict as many casualties and injuries as possible on a large group of people. We don't call it active shooter anymore because we're seeing different weapons being used, vehicles or bladed weapons, and about like bomb threats as well. So these are things that we need to keep in the back of our mind. If we're going to look at the 9 steps for risk and security planning, the first one would be to conduct a threat assessment. So a threat assessment is we take a look at what our assets, what are we trying to protect? The people, the equipment, things like that. And we're looking at what are the threats that are going to could be applied against. When we've established what the threats are, then we look at, okay, if that's the threat, what is the probability that that threat would materialize? And what would be the consequence if it did? And we start putting in strategies to mitigate it. So, like the prior proper planning, the first step is to conduct a threat assessment of the event or the venue. Once that's done, then we have the information we need to go forward. So we can meet with our team, our event teams, our organizers, and all the stakeholders. Now, these meetings, which is step 2, is very important for a couple of different reasons. One, it brings a fresh pair of eyes to the meeting. So once we've done that original threat assessment, maybe somebody picks up on something that was missed. So having that person bring it up, we can prepare for it in advance rather than go forward with a plan that's incomplete. The other thing is it's a bit of a team building exercise. And finally, it brings people into the know. It lets people know that your safety is of a concern and everybody goes forward knowing what the plan is. The next 3 steps are pretty common. 3 is to conduct a site survey. Then number 4, we develop a site plan. Number 5, we develop a crowd control plan. And then number 6 is when we put it all together with the plans and the assessments, and we're going to determine the necessary resources. So the resources that you might need could be paramedics, could be paid police, it could be security guards, but we're determining what resources we need to mitigate the risk that we identified in our threat assessment. Once we've done that, we can develop our organizational chart, establish our teams. The next step is to assign specific personnel. And then our final step, should time and budget resources permit, conduct training and rehearsals. So I always liken this to the fire drills that we used to do in school. Obviously, we didn't set a fire to do it, but we actually walked through it. In an event, it could be a matter of just going through how would you do an evacuation and just rehearse getting all the entry points and exit points open. When we're determining the risk and the security requirements, we can take a very, very simple example and say that we ask ourselves 4 questions, especially where security is concerned. What is security being brought in to protect? Is it the assets? Is it the venue? Is it the equipment? That's part of our threat assessment. Then we look at what are the resources we need to protect those assets, the threats that are against the assets, and the skills needed to protect against the threat. So I'm going to just use a very, very simple example to show this. So if we're talking about a beer tent with a capacity of 300 people, well, what are the assets? The assets would be the attendees, the event staff, the volunteers, the beer, the tents, the equipment that's in the tent, any money that's exchanged, the inventory. So these are all assets that you would list that could be targeted. Then we look at what could happen. What are the threats? Well, the threats, for like just some examples, would be over intoxication. How are we going to deal with that? Robbery, if people are going to try and steal the money. Theft, if they're going to try and steal the inventory. Assault, those type of things. Each one may call for a specific risk plan on how we're going to deal with it. And then we take a look at what skills do we need to have in our team to address these threats or these risks. And some of them from a security point of view, well, alcohol is being served. So obviously we're going to have smart serve certification to make sure that would go towards mitigating the over intoxication threat. If our staff are all aware of what the point of over serving is. Use of force is another one that we talk about. Now, use of force, it sounds a lot more aggressive than it actually is. Use of force training really teaches staff about the force continuum and making sure that the response is equal to the level of threat that's present so that we're not overreacting. In most cases, just a visual presence is enough to do it, which is why security or safety staff should never be covert. We always want to keep it overt so people see that the security staff is there. But use of force training, it also teaches the Criminal Code and Trespass to Property Act, which could come into play. Tactical communication would be an important skill to make sure is on the team. How to address, use verbal judo to de-escalate the situation. Situational awareness is one that we really stress because we want to address the situation as it's forming, and we don't want to wait till afterwards and then be reactive. We want to be proactive as we're addressing these situations. And situational awareness teaches us to be aware of what's happening around. The one thing that we really stress is that communication is key. And we can do this a couple of ways. We talked about it in step number 2 of the 9-point checklist. We're talking about the meeting with the stakeholders. So a pre-event briefing is really important. For our security team, it could be something simple as making sure that everybody on the team knows what the civic address is. So if you ever had to call a 911, you're not saying send the police to this festival. You can actually give an address where they're supposed to come. Other important things is where's the first aid kit, where the first aid station, where are AEDs kept, where are fire extinguishers kept, what are the alternate exits. So that even that 15-minute briefing before the event really helps get people buy-in rather than having a security guard just show up, stand at a door and not know what they're doing or what everything is. So the pre-event briefing, key. And then the other thing that we really stressed is the post-event meeting. So from our lessons learned, being able to pull the information from all the different teams and look at, okay, these are the things that came up and this is how we dealt with it. And if it were to occur, we'd either A, do the same thing again, or B, maybe we can tweak it a little bit to make our response faster or better. That type of thing. So lessons learned is most people just take a big sigh of relief once the event's done, and but there is the next step to make sure that we're learning from our experiences. Communication on during the event, like always, we want to set up the devices in advance. So for most event security, we use radios or walkie-talkies, but you'd be surprised at the number of times that they're not fully charged at the beginning of the event, or they're not all programmed to the same frequency. So doing a quick test of those and having a secondary protocol, part of our risk management, is making sure that in the event of a communication failure, we're still able to get the emergency information out. So a lot of people will use radios as their primary, cell phones as their secondary. Some teams will actually issue emergency whistles in the case of a total communication failure, just to flag somebody's attention. The other thing that we find really important from a risk management point of view is to appoint a lead for every team so that the communication can flow properly and quickly. So if the security team has a lead, that's the only person that's talking to the event organizers. And if the event organizers have to pass something on to security, it goes through the team lead. That way you don't have an event organizer running to each security person trying to make sure that they understand what's new. We have clear leadership in place. So, and going both ways, the security lead needs to know who's in charge. And the last point I'd make on communication is making sure that we know who the decision maker is. So if we have an emergency plan in place and that emergency plan calls for an evacuation, who makes that decision? So that everybody knows to look to that person, and not everybody is standing around waiting for the other person to make the decision. So who is the decision maker that can move things forward? From a basic response in during the event, we use the Check Call Care acronym, or the Check Call Care SAFE. So we recognize that people are the most important assets, and we say this over and over in our training. People are what can't be replaced. So our priority is always to move them out of harm's way. So any emergency plan, before we start anything else, we want to make sure that the people, the stakeholders, the attendees, and so on, are moved out of the way and into a safe place. The way we do that is using Check Call Care. So first is to check on the person, determine if they need help. So this, like from a first aid point of view, everybody has the right to refuse help. But we will go over and just say, "Hi, my name is Scott. Can I help you?" Or it's a mass thing, we'll talk to the group. But we determine if they need help. And if they do need help, we want to move them to a safe location, somewhere that we can take care of them properly. Then that's check. Then the call for it is to call for the appropriate help. So if the police are appropriate, we're going to call the police. If they need paramedics, we're going to call the paramedics. In the event of a young child, we're going to maybe call the family members, but we're going to call for somebody. And then the care is that we're going to stay with that person until help arrives. And once again, this is taken from our first aid training, that once first aid is started, we never leave the person until it's somebody of an equal or higher level of training has taken over. We don't know what type of mental stress or anything that person is going through. So we're going to stay with them and care for them until the help that we called for has arrived. So if we look at the takeaways, our security and emergency risk planning begins by looking at what could happen. So we want to look and detail a response for each one of them. So those emergency plans, they can be either general or specific. A general emergency response plan, usually called an all hazards plan, could be that the same thing happens in the event of all emergencies. So if we have a bomb threat, we have a fire, we have a mass attack, maybe the response is all going to be the same, evacuation. So that's a more general one. In the simple case that I used, we'll probably have a different one for over intoxication, a different one for robbery, but how is the team going to respond to our specific threats? Second takeaway that I would say is that the people are our most critical asset. So we're going to make sure everything we do is designed to make sure that they are safe. And we're going to use the check, call, care to move them out of harm's way and stay with them until proper help takes over. And the last point that I would make is that we want to bring stakeholders into the know, involve them in the planning, involve them in the training, involve them in the meetings, because the more eyes that are on a project, the more complete it's going to be, the more buy-in you're going to have from the stakeholders. A security guard that is allowed to address his or her experiences in a meeting is that much more likely to implement and retain the knowledge of a security plan. So rather than operating in silos, bring everybody together in the plan so that they're able to have buy-in, team building, and in the event of an emergency, muscle memory takes over because they've been trained on it. So thank you very much for your kind attention. It's a subject that I'm very passionate about. I believe that my contact information is available if you should have any questions or would like any further information about this, but I really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Wilson. I'm from Tanner Insurance Brokers, and I'm a commercial insurance broker specializing in helping live events and festivals arrange liability, property, and various other types of insurance. I wanted to talk to you guys today about some best practices whenever you're going to buy insurance, whether it's for the first time or maybe to shop around. And I want to talk about a couple insurance products that are a little bit lesser known. One of them being directors and officers insurance, and the other one being event cancellation insurance. If we have time in the end, I'll touch on a couple other things along the way. Whenever you're looking to buy insurance, it's important that you put together an emergency response plan. The bigger the event, the more attendees you have, the more details you're going to want to put into this plan. But basically, it outlines what procedures you're going to follow step by step if there is an emergency and you need to shut down the show or evacuate. Having a document like that in place is going to make insurance purchasing easier for you and also a little bit more cost effective. Next, you're going to want to get a referral to a established commercial insurance broker, and it's best, in my opinion, if you go to a brokerage that's independently owned and operated. Some insurance brokerages these days are owned by insurance companies, so it's really hard to differentiate which ones are independent. But for the most part, they like to advertise that fact. So a quick look on their website will let you know whether they're independent or not. Getting an insurance broker that is familiar with events and live events in particular is going to be important. These policies are not package policies like some other industries, and you really need to piece together the individual coverages that you need for each festival. Another good point for the festival organizers is to give as much information as possible to the broker and to the insurance companies as you can. One of the biggest mistakes I see with festivals and events is they might miss a piece of information here or there, or maybe a smaller event that they hold at a different time of the year. And if you go to add those after you've already arranged your insurance, sometimes it can be challenging even to get it approved, and other times it can be costly. Where if you get it all encompassed right out of the gate, it's a lot easier and again more cost effective that way. And another really important thing is to look at the exclusions on your policy. So, a lot of people think that when you buy, say, a commercial general liability, which pays for mostly bodily injury and property damage that might be caused, that they're very comparable from one policy to the next. And although they are in the wording itself, the exclusions that can be added to the policy by the insurance company's underwriter can really define what you're covered by or covered for. So, for example, if you have a festival where there's a lot of participants involved, like the crowd gets involved, whether it's a sporting event, maybe let's say Hope Beach volleyball, for example. It's not okay to have a participants exclusion, which would not apply the coverage to the people that are actually participating in the event. Whereas if you have an event where there's nobody from the crowd that partakes in the event, and it's all just the professional paid, celebrities or singers, then it'd be okay to have something like that. So you really have to pay close attention to the exclusions on your policy, because that's what makes a difference from one policy to the other, and it can also affect the costs. So it's really important not just to compare costs, but also to compare exclusions. One thing that's often missed, actually, a couple things that are often missed when people arrange insurance or they're operating the festival is not asking to be added as additionally insured onto your vendor's insurance policy. So, for example, stages are very high risk these days. Stages collapse with high winds. So if you have a stage company coming in to set up their stage, it's very important that they provide you with a certificate of insurance that names your organization as additionally insured on their policy. So if anything were to happen to the stage and there's an injury, their policy would respond to defend you, just like you're a named insured on the policy. So it's a good way to transfer risk from your operation to the vendors, which is appropriate. So a lot of people miss doing that. It's really important that you pay attention to that. Another thing is arranging the insurances on an annual term, as opposed to just having a special event policy for however long your event is. So this is going to be important if you do host any planning sessions or any fundraising sessions throughout the year. Again, you're going to want to make sure the organization has annual coverage so that if anyone's at your premises throughout the year and they slip or fall and injure themselves, you're still covered and it's not just confined to the event days. Moving on to the two products that I wanted to talk about today, which is directors and officers insurance and event cancellation insurance. I'll start with the directors and officers. Basically, what this liability insurance covers for is if you have a board of directors that's responsible for managing the festival, managing the employees, volunteers, as well as the financials of the event, it's really important that you get a directors and officers liability policy, because those directors can be held personally liable for any mismanagement of funds, and also for any claims brought against them from volunteers or employees with regards to employment practices. So if you were to potentially discriminate against somebody, let somebody go without a proper severance package or for without proper reasons, any type of sexual harassment or retaliation against employees. Those are all picked up under directors and officers, also known as management liability. And these policies, if you're on a very low budget and maybe you don't have a lot of employees, maybe no employees and all volunteers, these can be arranged for as low as $400 a year, something like that, for $1 million in coverage. So it's well worth it. It allows the director. It allows you to attract directors to the event more easily, because these days most directors will want that in place before volunteering their time. So that brings us over to event cancellation insurance. Event cancellation insurance is a very unique product. It can be arranged in different ways. So the main coverage for event cancellation is adverse weather. And with climate change and the increased wind speeds that we're seeing in the area, it's becoming more and more of a risk for every festival that's outdoors. Unfortunately, that's increasing the cost of these policies, but it's also um, allowing the insurance companies to be more flexible with what you cover, what you choose not to cover, and deductibles and things like that to try to bring the premium lower. So the main coverage is for adverse weather. That's mainly high wind speeds and lightning. If the event is unsafe to continue, whether it be, you can arrange it to have your meteorologist make that decision, or an outside third party company that pulls the trigger. And if the event gets canceled for that reason, there's two options that you could insure against. One of them is just your expenses that you've already paid and you can't recover. This is the less expensive option. And let's say you've paid for a lot of alcohol, or paid for some vendors to come that you can't cancel. It's too late, and you're already on the hook for those costs. The insurance would respond and reimburse those costs to you if the event gets canceled. The second way to do it is on a profits basis. So if you had anticipated a certain amount of profit or revenue from the event taking place, you could insure against those lost profits. So it's a little bit more expensive, that type of claims basis. But of course, you're going to benefit more from it in the end, which kind of goes against the whole theory of insurance, which is to put you back in the same place you were before any event. This sort of type of insurance you can stand to profit from. So yeah, those are the two types. You can also add various riders of coverage to event cancellation policies. So one of them, really important these days, is terrorism coverage, or threat of terrorism. So this rider basically states, within a certain radius of your event, if there's any threats of terrorism or actual terrorism and the event can't proceed, then it would pay just like the adverse weather claim. So with politics being as polarized as they are these days, and the economy getting worse and worse and worse, we're going to see potential threats of terrorism become more and more frequent, especially at the larger events. So it is something that is important to be considered. And another rider you can add is non-appearance of your guests or artists or celebrities. So the non-appearance coverage, it applies to travel delays, death, accidents, illness. So COVID could be covered if the artists were to catch COVID and not able to travel. That is a rider that's available on event cancellation insurance. So um, insurance is one of those things where you can there's always available insurance to purchase, and you can cause yourself to go insurance poor, I call it, if you buy everything. And it's important to sit down with a broker and with your operations people and decide sort of where best fits within your budget. So that brings me to, there was a question asked when I was preparing for this presentation that says, we had a low budget and we're not sure what insurance that we should buy and what's most important. So mainly the go-to liability insurance is commercial general liability that pays for bodily injury and property damage that you may be responsible for. This one's important to have, even if you are, maybe even an online event or not a huge event where injuries aren't really common, but any venue that you use is going to require this insurance, and any funding that you apply for, whether it be provincial or federal funding, is going to require you to have commercial general liability. So it's pretty much the first go-to policy that anybody's going to buy. Second to that, if you have a board of directors, I really recommend directors and officers insurance. It's one where if people have a low budget, they often go without for a while. But I definitely recommend having commercial general liability, directors and officers in place. And when it comes to your budget, if you're having a hard time fitting the insurance costs in the budget, it might be worth considering looking at all the hazards that you have in your event or operation. And instead of not buying enough insurance to cover off certain risks, you might want to scale back on the hazards. For example, if you're having an event and you're planning on putting up grandstand bleachers, those are known to be risky also. There's a lot of injuries that happen with those. Maybe you skip those for the first year or two while you get your foundation settled and not have the grandstand. Maybe skip live animals in the event or fireworks, or maybe choose not to have alcohol sales until you get a more firm base and can insure it properly. And finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about property insurance and what you can do if you have equipment, your own equipment on site, or maybe if you have artists coming to your event and they require you to cover some of their equipment. It can be easily done on a property insurance, which generally, depending on your commercial liability insurer, you can add property pretty easily to those policies. So a miscellaneous property floater is what it's called when you own the property and it's going to be at the site temporarily or maybe even away from the site. It really doesn't matter where it is. You can add a miscellaneous property floater to your policy. Depending on the coverage amount and deductible, that's sort of how the price is rated. Typically, insurance companies are going to want any property that you're covering while it's at the event to either be fenced or locked to something that's pretty hard to move with either a bicycle lock or something like that. Just having something sitting open in a field somewhere, it's going to be difficult to buy insurance for. So just make sure that there's some type of security in place for your property. When it comes to other people's property, it's a little bit more difficult. You have to arrange it on what's called a Bailey's form. It's a property of others form. And in order to do that, you're just going to want descriptions of what the property is that other people are bringing to your venue. You communicate that to your insurance broker, and they can speak with the insurer to arrange that Bailey form, property of others form. It's usually smaller amounts. I've seen it up to $100,000. And finally, there was a question asked: how do we ensure that volunteers that we have at our event are covered to handle cash? And what that is it's a crime coverage on your property policy. So you add what's called it's employee dishonesty crime coverage, and typically those amounts are 5, 10, $25,000. And then if there's any allegations of your employees or volunteers taking cash from the site, it would be reimbursed to you if you made a claim under that one. So that's just a bit high level of over the more important coverages. There's a lot more options out there. If you're interested in talking to a broker about what your festival needs, feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name's Chris Wilson, Tanner Insurance, and thanks so much for listening, guys. You have a great day.
And that wraps up this episode of Fest Forward Advisor Talks, presented by the Ottawa Festival Network. All of the resources and links mentioned throughout this episode will be available in the episode show notes, as well as transcriptions in both French and English. For information on OFN and our members, please visit us online at ottawafestivals.ca. And if you have any questions or feedback related to this podcast, please send us an email at festforward@ottawafestivals.ca. Thank you so much for listening, and please remember to subscribe to this podcast to catch future episodes. where we will dive into even more hot topics festival and event organizations need to know to grow and support their organizations. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues and leave us a review. That's all for now. Stay tuned and stay festive.